Thank you all being here today. It's so lovely and wonderful. A bit of, old, Grimshaw breakfast talk feeling coming back, and that makes me very, very happy. So thanks for being here, Jonathan. Yeah. Okay, I'll start with the respect to country. We take this time to acknowledge that we stand on the land of the people of the Kulin Nation and
the Wadawurrung,
physically and virtually. Our program exists on what always and always will be on Aboriginal land, and we pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. From one side of the Yarra River to the other, we are honoured to once again explore the sacred land, albeit this time in digital capacity. As non-Aboriginal person, we recognise that we benefit from living and working on Aboriginal land and acknowledge that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. This fact remains at the forefront of our mind every day, given our focus on the modern built environment. So thanks, Brianna, for that. That's a fantastic one. Thank you. Well, welcome. Before I start, I have to say, last week I was preparing the run sheet with Jonathan, and we were trying to cram everything as much as we can from him. And at the end of it, he said, "You know, I'm Irish, so I can talk for as long as you let me." So all I can say is, between the Irish and I today, we're going to bring a solid hour of all killers and no fillers. No. Okay. So before I introduce Jonathan, I thought we'll quickly go to, we'll get a message from our sponsor. That's Neil Stornell, who's also my boss. Neil Stornell, he is the managing partner of the Grimshaw Melbourne studio, and there he is at the studio. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Tava, and I'm in the virtual version of our gallery. So just for a bit of nostalgia for those of you that attended in previous times. Welcome back. It was a fairly informal start to this event, but it's good to be back, and it's good to be rebooting our breakfast talks at lunchtime. So if you got up at 11 a.m, then it's still a breakfast talk, I guess. But thank you for attending. We've got 77 plus online, so that's a very healthy forum. It's good to see you all. And I look forward to hearing from Jonathan, who I've just realised last presented actually in the gallery 3 years ago. So time flies when you're having fun, although the last 4 months may not have flown quite so quickly. But as we enter this kind of new life and this new world, I think a lot of the designers on the call will be working out how to deliver designs, promote designs and collaborate in a very different environment than we're all familiar with, and through the digital space, learning new technologies, learning new timeframes, learning engagement, effectiveness through mediums like this that we probably all spending huge amount of our day on. So the conversation about inclusive design, Jonathan's going to speak to, I'm really looking forward to it. We are trying to keep this with a level of informality that the breakfast events had. We will be asking questions later, and use the flag your hand or the chat function. And it's good to see Jeff. There was rumours that Jeff wasn't going to be joining us, but I have seen him here, so thank you. So there is some normality to life after all, but I'll probably park it there and hand back to Tava. But thank you. It's great to see everybody. We are trying to reboot these more frequently again. We're back with you in a digital space, and hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be back together sharing a coffee and a croissant in the gallery itself. So, and thank you to, I'm not the only sponsor, but thank you to Open House as part of sponsoring this as well. So thank you all. Back to you, Tava.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Neil. That was, okay, Jonathan Daly. I'll do a quick background, because we know at the breakfast talk we don't usually do a bio, but I will do this for Jonathan. I met Jonathan Daly when he started his Urban Behaviour Lab, which is UB Lab, after a stint at GHD, where he was part of the Urban Design and Planning Group. And that was a time where you would see Jonathan Daly in the news just about every 4 or 5 days. There he is on ABC talking about yet another something that the city should be doing, the government should be doing, the bicycle lanes, and it was just a bit too much when you see your friend on the ABC News. So what is he doing that I am not doing? Must try harder. And if he wasn't busy enough, he decided to go and do his PhD, because that's the kind of person Jonathan is. So why don't you? And he went to do his PhD, and he gave us a talk at the Grimshaw Gallery on the topic of his PhD about 3 years ago. And since then, he's been to do his field research, and today he's going to start with a recap of that conversation on what he found on his field study. He went to Superkillen, Toronto, and you did walk up and down Fed Square like a suspect for a little bit. And,
or a lot, yeah.
A lot, yes. And then he'll go on to talk about what are we doing now within these new parameters. How can we take back the city? How can we take back public space? What can we do? And then he'll close with your fantastic new job that you have at the Geelong City Council. So he's now the manager of heritage and city champion. So that's an exciting role. So Jonathan, I know that you're in a happy place, because when I first met you, you had your hair shaped up as a non-moving wave. So I can tell from the years that, it's just gradually, now you're really good, and you've established, you're happy, you're settled. So thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Tava. Hi, everyone. Maybe I'll start maybe where the research came from really quickly. So I was doing a series of projects in my practice that were related to, I guess, behavioral issues in public spaces. And a common thread through all of those projects was ethnic cultural differences. So, for example, how we walk in the street. And I guess traditionally, or the social norm in Australia, is that you walk on the left-hand side. And some people had issues with how non-Australians walked on the street, which may have been on the right or may have been in the middle. And when we looked into it, you find that around the world, people have got different practices. Some have got social norms, some don't. And that was of interest to me as to what was then creating these conditions of conflict. And that research then led me to realize that, in fact, in environments where we have more control, where we enforce more rules and regulations and are stricter about how we use public spaces, we actually create more potential for conflict. And the problem with this is that it's a problem in itself, of course, but in a Western context in particular, we've become more ethnically diverse, particularly in the last 20 years. But we've continued to design our cities in a very monocultural way, so in a very white Western way, effectively. And the problem with this, of course, is that people from different parts of the world interpret and use public space in different ways. So we create these conditions where a lot of people in our communities can look out of place and feel out of place. And then this also gives rise to negative ideas about other people, about migrants, refugees, minority ethnic groups, and so on. So I wanted to look at, I began looking at what role the built environment played in that, and if the built environment had the agency to actually create conditions where that kind of difference could encounter one another. So that's essentially where the research came from. And the last time I spoke at the gallery event, that's where I was up to. I was really just telling everyone what I was going to do. I had discovered this issue, I had this question, and I was kind of setting out on that journey. And as Tava said, that's a few years ago now, and I've completed that journey. And yeah, and I've learned a few things along the way. And I was just going to go share some, I guess, some stories with everyone today about the 3 case studies that I looked at. So the first, well, when I was choosing my case studies, I did three very in-depth case studies. And because my focus was on the Western world, I wanted essentially to choose to have a bit of coverage of the Western world. So I have one from Australasia, which is Federation Square in Melbourne, one from Europe, I chose Superkillen in Copenhagen, and one from North America, which is Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. And yeah, we'll start with Superkillen. That's where I went to first, to Copenhagen. And I'm going to just quickly share the screen so you get just a reference point.
Ah.
So you can all see Superkillen. So Superkillen is actually comprises 3 spaces. So there's the red square, the black square, and then the green park. And Superkillen sits in an area called Nurbo. It's also the area where most of the migrants and refugees go, or were housed over a number of years. This housing estate that I'm showing here is called Mjølnerparken. Mjølnerparken is deemed or designated as Denmark's #1 ghetto. So there was a lot of intercultural conflict in this area, and Superkillen was partly developed to try and address that intercultural conflict and improve social cohesion in Nørrebro and in Copenhagen. So I guess one of the interesting things about this case study, when I did my ethics approval at Melbourne Uni, it came back as high risk, which was a bit of a surprise. Why on earth would Copenhagen be deemed high risk? I think that was a mistake, but when I went there, I discovered that in the month before I arrived, there were 26 shootings in Superkillen. And all these shootings were related to a turf war between gangs of drug dealers. So why was there a turf war in Superkillen? One of the impacts of Superkillen has been gentrification. It's part of an ongoing process of the gentrification of Nørrebro, which is probably the last suburb in Copenhagen to really gentrify. And Superkillen is effectively you could call it the front line of gentrification. There's not much of Nørrebro that's really left, and part of the impact of that gentrification has been to increasingly to push working class and particularly migrants and refugees out of the area. So whereas before they could open, it was relatively easy to start a small business, find employment and so on, they've been sort of steadily pushed out of that area and continue to be. But the impact of Superkillen, which is now one of the top 10 most visited attractions in Copenhagen, has been to attract lots of people there, and a lot of people with money to spend. And effectively, it's created a very lucrative market for drug dealers. So you could argue that instead of addressing some of the problems of intercultural conflict in the area, it has in fact made it worse. And there was even a shooting in Superkillen when I was there. It was two Swedish tourists were accidentally caught in that crossfire and shot. No one died, thankfully.
Wow.
So that was really interesting. And then in terms of the design itself, there's so much I could talk about, but I just want to share a couple of kind of findings from there. One is around this whole issue of representation. So quite often when we design a public space where ethnic diversity is a key sort of aspiration, we tend to turn to representation, and that was a key element or strategy of the design team. So the idea was to procure 108 objects from around the world that represented all of the different ethnic groups in Nurbo, in that area. But it didn't turn out exactly as planned. So, for example, 60% of all of those objects ended up coming from Western countries, even though there's only 9% of the local population come from a Western context, including Denmark. And there were other issues as well. So this kind of desire to culturally code all of these objects meant they had to find objects to code. So they did that with almost everything, even the sewer lids and rubbish bins, and that didn't sit very well with those ethnic groups that ended up being represented in this public space by utilitarian items such as rubbish bins and sewer lids. And another aspect of the design that was really problematic was that the design team came up with this idea. Well, it's not their idea, that the conflict and tension in public space is a naturally occurring phenomena, but they decided to kind of engineer it in a way. So what they did was to put the object that represented Palestinian people next to an object that represented Jewish people or people from Israel. And in doing so, they reproduced that geopolitical conflict, which was really a big issue. There had been Jewish people living in Nurbo, and pretty much from it was, well, even pre it being a suburb of Copenhagen. So the first use of that land was actually a Jewish cemetery, just outside the medieval walls of the city. And so they've been there a long time. And then in the 70s, there were guest workers from Palestine that came through Lebanon, that came to Nurbo. So Jewish people and Palestinian people had actually coexisted in the area very peacefully for decades, until Superkillen came along and actually raised those tensions again and contributed to all sorts of intercultural tensions in the area. No, it's not all bad, not by any means. There are a lot of elements that work really well, and one aspect of the build form that I discovered that worked incredibly well was a particular form of seating in the space. So most of the seating in Superkillen is like most of the seating we find in public spaces in Western cities. They're straight benches. They typically cater for comfortably for 2 people, but maybe 3 if you know each other. And it's really a private form of seating. It doesn't lend itself very well to social interaction. And the other type is kind of circular seating, which is actually even less social, because you not only face out, you face away from the person next to you. But one seat in Superkillen worked incredibly well in terms of not just social interaction, but encounter between different ethnic groups. And that was a kind of concave shape, so kind of like a semicircle. And the reason it worked is a combination of its length and also the the gentle curvature, so that people could sit by themselves, they could sit in small groups, but they could make eye contact if they wanted. So they weren't forced to make forced into conversations, but the potential was there, the possibility was there. And the other element that was really important was where that bench was located. So it sat at the intersection of two key paths that local people would cross, going about their day-to-day business on a regular basis. So those sort of encounters would happen regularly. So that was some of the things I discovered in Superkillen. There's a lot more, but obviously we don't have time. And as Tava said, I talk too much because I have this affliction of being Irish. I'm probably talking too much anyway. So after that, I went to Toronto, and Toronto was absolutely fascinating for me, and it became a very personal story as well. So I discovered something about Toronto that I never knew, and I'm guessing most of you don't know either. Toronto is known as the Belfast of Canada, and so Belfast, as in Northern Ireland, where I'm from. And what I discovered is that for 100 years, every mayor of Toronto was a Northern Irish Protestant Orangeman. Now, why is this important? Well, I'm not religious at all, but I was raised in Northern Ireland, a Catholic, and the Orange Order are to Catholics what the KKK is to African Americans. So for 100 years, Toronto was effectively controlled by a very conservative, very discriminatory government, form of governance. And this came to an end in, I think it was 1955. So the then mayor, a guy called Leslie Saunders, wrote this very sectarian article in a newspaper comparing Catholics to the Nazis and fascists and so on. And well, cut a long story short, he was forced to resign, and a new mayor was elected called Nathan Phillips. Nathan Phillips was a Jew, and he ran under the banner of Mayor for All the People. And he wanted to transform, he wanted to take Toronto from this kind of very conservative, monocultural, discriminatory past and move it into a more liberal, progressive, and open society. And to kind of kickstart this, he identified the development of a new city hall and public square, civic square, as a symbol of that change in the city. Now, the irony is, well, he had to find space in the city to build this. And the irony is that the space that he found to build it on happened to be the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in Toronto, a place called St. John's Ward. So it was designated a slum and was effectively completely erased, was bulldozed down to make way for this new development. And Nathan Phillips Square, the City Hall and the square is a modernist form of modernist architecture and urbanism. The City Hall is quite elegant building, but the square itself is a huge expanse of white concrete. And the modernist architecture has been criticized for many things, but one of them is this idea that it could unify cultural differences. It could create a form of architecture that could overcome differences. But in doing that, it effectively neutralized difference, which is very productive in terms of building a society and so on. But Nathan Phillips was successful in creating that symbol for the city, and it is a very important symbol. It does represent that change. And in the 1990s, the City Hall and the square was was given heritage protection. And then in the 2012, they undertook a revitalization scheme. The issue with the heritage protection meant that the revitalization scheme became all about reinstating the original scheme by the Finnish architect V.O. Ravel. And that meant part of that was to declutter the space. So the space over time had been programmed with a number of different elements to kind of fill this vast expanse that was really could only be used for major civic events and wasn't really serving the day-to-day purpose. Yeah.
Jonathan, are your slides supposed to be changing or?
They were, sorry.
Oh, okay. That's all right. It's fine.
Talking
it's just
too much.
The crowd are really into it. Yes.
Yeah, so this is Nathan Phillips Square and the City Hall. Apologies. Yeah, so the heritage protection effectively, it limited the potential to, I suppose, to develop the space in a way that was appropriate for the current needs of the city and the future needs and who lived in the city. Because in 1950s, when it was being developed, the city was still around 70-odd% white Anglo-Saxon. By the time of the revitalization in 2012, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants only account for, I think it's less than 12%. So Toronto is the most multicultural, most ethnically diverse city in North America. But this heritage protection effectively limited any potential to really take account of the needs of the people. And I interviewed some of the directors from the city council. I always remember this conversation. I asked the question, in response to a question about, how do they provide or how do they ensure they're providing for the needs of ethnic diversity? One of the interviewees said to me, well, we don't design for Somalian mothers, but we don't design them out either. And I asked them, how do you know? If you don't actually engage in that level of research, how do you know? So they didn't have an answer to that. And you see it effectively. You can see this playing out in the square. It's very limited in terms of what people do there, why they go there, through this very limited form of programming. What's really interesting, and you can see it in the image, is this Toronto sign. That was initially a temporary installation, but it's become kind of the focal point in the square, much to the disgust, I have to say, of a lot of architects and other sort of built environment professionals in the city who think it works against Ravel's original scheme. But say the people love it and everyone's drawn to it. Kids, people of all ages and gender and ethnic backgrounds. And because it draws all of those different people in, it naturally leads to forms of encounter between different ethnic groups. So it's the one element that's really successful, but it's an element that is considered by many to be alien and shouldn't be in the space at all. How am I doing for time, Tava?
I think you're going well. Yeah. Just
okay. So I'm going to leave Toronto and I'm going to come back home to Melbourne and talk just a little bit about Federation Square. Federation Square.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I spent for each of these case studies, my research, I spent over 200 hours observing life in each of the spaces, looking at how people interacted with each other, with different elements of the built form. And I have to be brutally honest about this. That in Federation Square, it's 200 hours of my life I'll never get back. There's so little really that happened there during that period. And I think there's a few reasons for that. But I think it's also interesting to go back to, I looked at the history of each of these spaces to kind of understand the forces that shaped the square that shaped the design brief that then influenced what happened. And what's really interesting is the Federation Square is it marks the centenary of federation, obviously. But what was the first? Well, the first act of federation was the infamous white-only policy, which is a sort of interesting element to studying intercultural encounter in the space itself. And I think if you look at the forces that were behind the square, there's obviously this long-standing issue of Melbourne never having a civic public space and wanting to address that, and that was an important part of it. But there's also a very strong element of what was happening in terms of globalization and the rise of neoliberalism, and the space being you have to think about who was this space actually intended for, who's the audience, and my argument is that it provided that iconic space that really helped put Melbourne into the global marketplace, and that its audience is more an international audience, more so than a local audience. But like Toronto and Nathan Phillips Square, it has become undeniably, and we've seen that with Apple, that it's a very meaningful for Melburnians. We're not sure if that's all Melburnians, but certainly for a lot of Melburnians, symbolically as that space that the city so long desired. But I think it works less well in terms of everyday use. So because of its location, because there's not a lot of places around it, it doesn't draw everyday life through it. It draws people to it, but not through it. So like most successful public spaces are really embedded in the fabric of the city, and they're nodes through which people move, going about their everyday lives. And because you get those paths that cross each other, they lead to kind of random encounters. And that's really important, because well, I would argue Federation Square as an event space and a venue is very, very successful. I think that's undeniable. And it does cater to a number of events for different ethnic groups and so on. And they have an important role to play. But in truth, they're a very sort of artificial setting for intercultural encounters with difference compared to everyday life. And I think that's really important. As Helen Wilson, a researcher in this area, said that encounters make difference. So they emphasize differences, but they also make a difference. And what she means by that is that they help us to, and through those encounters with difference, they open our eyes, and they help overcome sort of fixed ideas that we might have about difference, and help us, and through that process we learn to live better with difference.
Jonathan, what time of the day did you do this research? When were you there at Fed Square?
Oh, across the morning right through to the night, across the full week. And so I'd spend periods of a full week effectively there, and different periods of the year as well to account for that seasonal variation and so on.
Yeah, great. Shall we move on to the next part of your?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the conversation that we had was given the current parameters, and I sent you a picture of the city from the weekend where there was just nobody on Saturday afternoon in the city. How do we slowly open that up and take our city back? And it's quite depressing when you look outside and see where's the life in here. So how do we how do we move on? So you have some ideas of how do we take back this space and slowly revive it. So go for it.
Yeah, look, you can imagine for me, I just did 4 years looking at how we increase encounter in public spaces
Yeah.
of our cities. And then what happens is bloody pandemic, which all but ends any form of encounter in public space.
Killed it.
And there's been lots of discussions in the media about what happens now. And, what's the future of our cities? Is it the end of cities? And of course, I think, that is clearly, over the top kind of response, and cities are still going to be important. And we've had a lot of discussions about, the issues about contact, social distancing, and public transport. And there's been a very strong response, I think, globally, a bit less so maybe in Australia, but about reclaiming public space to use for, to enable people to give more space to people to walk and also to cycle. And that's really important. But I'm also interested in being in, not just moving through public space, but actually being able to be in public space, to occupy public space. And I think we still need to be able to do that. We need to be able to stop and sit, and we still need to have proximity to other people. I think it's very important for for society's health and well-being to have interactions, encounters with strangers. Otherwise, we're all just going to revert, hide in our little bubbles wherever they may be, and we don't get that the benefit of that encounter with different. So how do we do that? And I think it's about rethinking the role of our public space as being, it has so much capacity to be more multifunctional than the kind of monofunctional approach that we currently take. And there are cities around the world that are already onto this, that are turning the center of their cities over to people and removing the traffic completely. Now, how we do that, where we do that, is not confined to, for example, the center of Melbourne. We also need to think about, our neighborhoods, activity centers in our neighborhoods, and how that might work as well. And there's some fantastic work that's already been done around the world, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. There are great ideas that we can borrow. I'm particularly interested in the work that's come out of the organization NACTO in the US. That's the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It's funded by Bloomberg Associates, and they developed guidelines for pandemic recovery focused on streets, public spaces. And they've looked at how streets could function as markets, how they could function as schools, outdoor schools, how they could function as play spaces, how they could work for concerts, and even how they could function as spaces for protest, which, given the current situation with Black Lives Matter, I think that's particularly interesting, that we could potentially accommodate protest, even in the current situation. And of course, the way that they're proposing to do this is the same way that we're proposing to take back space for walking and cycling, which is through temporary and tactical urbanism, which is cheap, it's quick to do, it's very adaptable. It can be, we can apply it in so many different contexts, and it's a way to reinvent our streets and public spaces, not just for during the recovery, but we then need to think about going forward. How do we, what do we learn from that, and how do we rethink our cities in the future? Great.
Yeah. Well, we'll send a couple of links later to everyone who attended on some of those case studies that you mentioned. So tell us about this new great job that you have and what's going on.
Yeah. So a few months back, I started a new role with the City of Greater Geelong, as manager of urban design and heritage. But I've also got a role as city design champion, which is linked to, I'm not sure many people know, but Geelong is the first city in Australia to be awarded designation of World City of Design by UNESCO. And the designation recognises Geelong's, well, a number of things, Geelong's very rich Aboriginal heritage and culture, a long history of textile and wool production, of course, the history of automotive design. So the ute was invented in Geelong, and you know, even after the cars are obviously no longer being manufactured in Geelong, but I recently discovered that in the Ford factory is still operating. It's one of Ford's main design centers in the world. Wow. And there's like 150 automotive designers based there, which was really interesting. Wow. And of course, Geelong's got a long history of manufacturing and really incredible heritage buildings and landscapes as well. Yeah, so my role is a city design champion is to drive design excellence in the built environment, and that's through a combination of things, including lifting up the quality of our buildings, taking the new buildings that come through, and Geelong is a busy place. There's a lot happening with the new. We started construction on the new civic precinct, so the new offices for the council. There's the station precinct master plan that's been developed, arts and cultural precinct master plan, and much more. A lot of development as we're trying to intensify the city. So it's really important that we get as much design excellence as possible in that process, but also that we protect our rich historic urban landscape, which really is, you know, the foundation of the city. We've got you know, excellent urban structure. We've got north-facing waterfront, some amazing buildings, and there's really a, you know, very strong foundation for to realise all that Geelong has to offer.
Wow! So all this is happening in Geelong. We should get out of the city more often, like leave postcode 3000. That's fantastic. Oh, that's great. So shall we take some questions? Shall we see what's going on? And we'll, oh God. Okay, how do we do this again? Okay. Jeffrey Robinson, because you know how he's a big fan. I think he dumped his last meeting just so he can come here for this. Thanks, Jeffrey. Question for Jonathan. If you had a chance to prepare a brief for Fed Square again, how would it have been different, and what are the process you would put in place to achieve a different result?
Thanks, Jeff. Big question. Look, it's a really tricky one. I think I would have taken the opportunity to probably develop more to the east, and try and create attractions, land uses that would draw people through the square. I think also maybe different tendencies for the buildings that frame the square, maybe more sort of everyday uses that might draw you know, people that live in the city more to it.
Yeah. Jeffrey, there we go. That's Jeffrey's answer. And we have one from Chris. Chris works at Grimshaw and cycles every day. And he's one of these annoying people that, you know, gets change and run during lunchtime. I mean, I don't get that, really. I really don't. But you know, he's big on public transport and doing all those fantastic things. So this is Chris's question. Cycling Swanston Street daily, I typically see more public gatherings or demonstration in front of the State Library. Why is that?
Yeah, great question. And I think what I would say is that, you know, it's interesting that this, it's probably I would agree, it's our most successful public space in the city. And in many ways, it's evolved rather than being designed as a public space. And it's got, it does sit within the, relatively in the center of the city. And you get a lot of, you got the library, you've got Melbourne Central across the way, you've got the tram stop, you've got a lot of activity around it and moving through it as people kind of move about the city, going about their day-to-day business. And I guess it's also, it's quite accessible as a space because of those connections with adjoining, streets and so on. I think that's why it's attractive, and I think it's also, it's got that so much life happening around it, and it's very visible. It's visible to so many people, and that's why it's an attractive space for protests.
Yeah, it's right in the middle, and the thoroughfare, as you say, actually goes through it. And if you want to stage a protest, I mean, that's where you're going to do it, I think. Okay, and Brendan put his hand up. So Brendan, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Jonathan. Fantastic. I had a couple of questions, actually. I know Federation Square relies on or puts a lot of effort into a constant stream of events and program. The first question is just, what your thoughts are on how important that is to a space. And then the second question is just, did you come across parts of these spaces where people could make them their own and customize little bits of it, and whether that's important in endearing the spaces to the local community as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Brendan, about how much do we need to, or should we have to curate public space. I think events in public space have got an important role. I think civic events have got an important role to play. But I think if you have to work really hard to activate a space, through constant programming, then it does say a lot about how the space functions on an everyday basis. And then the second question, yeah, look, even in in Federation Square, I think some of the, I didn't see a lot of appropriations of space by different groups there, but there was one interesting, probably the most interesting event that happened was a group of Chinese women that came to practice, I think, a form of traditional dancing in the space. And like, you pretty much need a permit to do anything. Even Tai Chi needs a permit in Federation Square, where it doesn't need a permit in any other public space in the city. But I think this group of women turned up and did their thing, and I spoke to them, and I said, "Oh, was it difficult to get a permit?" And they laughed and they said, "We didn't get a permit." and then I realized that the only reason that they probably weren't approached by the security and removed was because it just looked very formal. How they organized it and how they set up and how they were practicing. It probably looked like they had a permit.
Wow, the things you can get away with. Just dress well and turn up well. It's great. So can we go to another question? Can I have a female voice, maybe? That's not mine. No one? Oh, well. We've got Julie. Julie, take it away.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Julie.
To see, I'm definitely going to give you a call, but for now, you raised this interesting issue around shapes and spaces and positioning that foster engagement, and I like the way you sort of framed that. Do you find that there are really consistent patterns in certain shapes or structures that are put in built spaces that seem to either create a barrier or create a facilitator to engagement?
Yeah, there were definitely patterns that emerged. I mean, all of my findings are based on patterns. I mentioned about the seating, and I found that very consistent across the three spaces. Although only Superkillen had that kind of concave shape. Actually, another element of Superkillen that really was effective in enabling intercultural encounters was a couple of the objects. One was an octopus-shaped slide, came from Japan, and the other was a boxing ring that came from Thailand. And well, there's a number of things that are interesting. Neither of those objects have really got much ethnocultural meaning in Nirbo. There's not many Thai or Japanese people there. But they're both really novel objects to find in a public space. And they also enable people to you could do lots of things with them, right? They're not just a boxing ring. People could dance on it. They could hang upside down. They could lie on it. They could sit on it. And the octopus-shaped slide is similar. There's many different affordances that people find in it. And this creates a really interesting kind of spectacle. So they would both attract lots of different people, different ages and genders and so on, but particularly kids. And with kids come parents. And kids of all ethnic groups will mix and interact with each other, and that would happen. And then because their parents would then be drawn into proximity of one another, that would lead to encounters. But the spectacle would also draw in other people that just wanted to watch, and then that would also lead to more forms of encounter. Yeah, so that kind of novelty's got a role to play, particularly where it lends itself to enabling people to do lots of different things, to really play with it, to express themselves in different ways, rather than limiting them to certain sort of activities.
Yeah, that is what's on the invitation, the slide, because a few people have wrote back and said that looks like something from a Batman movie, but that is the Japanese octopus slide, which is very, very popular among the adults as well. So that's fantastic. So I think we'll wrap this up, and we know where to find Jonathan. And at the end of this talk, I'll send a couple of links of a few case studies that he had mentioned, and your contact details maybe, so we can, pelt you with some more questions. Very quickly before you finish, how and where did you decide to do your PhD? Because you did it with, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I did it at the University of Melbourne.
Yeah.
With Professor Kim Dovey was my supervisor. Initially, I was going to go to New York. I was going to go to City University in New York because of their environmental psychology department. But that was obviously a big move, and we had University of Melbourne, which was just down the road from me. One of the top universities, highest ranked universities in the world. And Kim had, particularly in his early work, had strong parallels with what I wanted to look at. And yeah, I went to see Kim, and I remember the first thing, as I was sort of parking my backside on a seat in his office, he said to me, "I'm not supervising you."
Oh, that's one way to start. We should try that with everyone. Yes.
Interesting tactic.
Makes you work harder. Yes.
So I didn't know whether to continue sitting or try and reverse out of it.
Yes. But I mean, clearly, you managed to convince him and everything. So
3 hours later.
Oh God, oh well. what can we do? Anyway, hey, thank you so much for being our first speaker. This is my first webinar, so I'm glad you're the one that, you know, we've interviewed. That was very, very interesting and very topical. So
Thank you, Tava.